items. First, we will record this series, so we'll share that afterwards, as well as Ken kindly said he would share the PDF slides from today as well, so we'll make sure we get those out to everybody afterwards. And as you may know, there's an active discussion and project within the Rochester community on district energy, so this is really exciting for me, and I think for others who are working on it, to kind of learn together with the community around what are the opportunities in order to make this district energy system as successful as possible and as sustainable as possible moving forward. One other item, if you have questions, if you could just type them in the chat, and I'll just wait for a natural pause toward when it makes sense to ask Ken, and then we'll also, as time allows, have an open Q&A session towards the end, but try to end promptly right around 1. Otherwise, I'll get out of the way and turn the keys over to Ken. And thanks again, Ken, for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Kevin mentioned, I'm Ken Smith. I'm the President and CEO of Evergreen Energy, and I look forward to sharing some comments with you today about the evolving energy system and the role that district energy systems play in the effort to decarbonize our economy. Just a little bit of information about Evergreen. We're based here in Minnesota. We've built a business that leverages our operations experience into consulting, operating, and developing systems. We're a bit unique in our space in that we own, operate, develop systems, but we also engineer, plan, we do business planning, and also community engagement. So a little bit different kind of player in this space, based right here in Minnesota. I guess I wanted to start with just kind of stepping back first and just thinking about what's all going on in the energy space. And if we really think about where our energy comes from and what it takes to serve the energy needs of our modern society, and also how quickly that system is changing. And while it can seem like in some ways it's moving slow, when you think about that, it's an infrastructure that has served us for many, many years. We're seeing announcements nearly daily about major changes to the energy system, from moving away from coal to large scale, utility scale solar installations, and then even a decreasing dependence upon natural gas, where that seemed like that was going to be a major component of the electrical grid. Even that's being rethought because of how quickly the system is changing. The system that we have has been serving us for many decades, generations, if you will, largely stagnant. Yes, some renewables coming on, some wind, some solar, but increasingly the amount of renewables coming on the grid is coming very rapidly, and technologies like solar, storage are also coming into play. So much so that coal is going to be decreased or eliminated, and natural gas is also on the way out. So it's a very different system. It is changing how we generate energy, how we move energy, and how we use energy. And I want to have that as a backdrop for some of the comments today. This is all happening on the electrical grid, and we're going to see that that's changing very, very rapidly. In Minnesota, in the last 15 years, the electricity generated in Minnesota has gone from 6% renewable to 29% renewable. This is from the Department of Commerce. So in 15 years, we went from roughly 30% carbon-free, if you include nuclear, to over 50% carbon-free energy. The Midwest has changed, not quite as fast as Minnesota has, but even the Midwest is projecting out, if they take into account the resource plans, the filings that have been made by a variety of utilities, that in the 2030s will be 70% carbon-free, with nuclear making up about 12%. And this is just based on current filings. So by 2034, on our current path with no changes, this is just what's been filed, we're on a path to be carbon-free by 2034 in the electrical grid. But the challenge is that we are not doing as well overall as a system. Minnesota has a goal to have 25% renewable energy. for the entire use of energy in the state by 2025, we are falling short of that goal. Similarly, we are well off the goal of achieving our carbon reductions. Minnesota had a goal of 2015 that we have missed that goal, and we are on pace to miss the 2025 goal as well. And certainly we need to pick up the pace if we're going to reach the 2050 goal. So while there's a lot of movement on the electrical grid, and that is good, the overall system, there's much more work to be done. And a part of that system is buildings. In Minnesota, and this is pretty emblematic of the US energy system, that roughly 40% of the energy in the US and about roughly 40% of the energy used here in Minnesota is used by buildings. And the most recent report, this was just filed here in March by the Department of Commerce, Division of Energy Resources. They're saying utilities are meeting our energy savings goals, and that would be around natural gas and electricity, but overall emissions, so carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and energy use from buildings is increasing. And so because of that, that is one of the contributing factors to why we are not achieving our both renewables and our carbon emission goals. So the grid is transforming. We are seeing decentralization of that grid, distributed energy resources like wind and solar, increasingly storage. You're seeing things like microgrids on a local level, demand response, where if you have an upset on the system, that you could be paid as a customer in some parts of the electrical grid, where you get paid to actually not use energy at certain times, or certainly incentivized to use energy at off-peak times. So that is occurring. We have digitalization occurring, so smart meters are coming on, two-way communication, that's a part of our future. So this grid is transforming, and we certainly have heard a lot recently about electrification. That on the electrical vehicle front, you're hearing that. So in transportation, you've heard a conversation about heat pumps and using heat pumps, particularly for residential. So all of this is occurring on the electrical grid. The reality is we are really undergoing an energy system transformation, and that looks a bit different. And so these factors, decentralization, digitalization, electrification, are all very important contributors to it. But in order to transform the system, to actually decarbonize the system, we have to work on first, and our approach is always to look at efficiency first. How do we have a highly efficient buildings? You can do self-generation and storage and things on a decentralized basis at the building level, which gives you more resilience. You can have microgrids that serve, say, a hospital complex, for example. You're also going to be very interconnected. This is going to be an interactive system. And so cybersecurity is going to play a major role. We certainly have heard a lot of that in the news recently, and energy systems are one of those that are attacked regularly. And then we also have decarbonization. So decarbonization of the system means we need to move beyond natural gas, particularly in the area of heating homes and businesses. And so that's going to lead to more things like, how are we going to reuse energy, heat pumps, and what I'll describe today, fourth generation thermal. So decarbonization through district energy systems, this is occurring in many parts around the globe. I'm going to share some projects with you today about some of the things that we are engaged in, but they're examples of what's going on in a variety of communities around the US and frankly around the world. But first, let's just level set on what district energy systems are. So really basic is that you are integrating buildings together, aggregating heating and cooling needs of multiple buildings. And it could be just heating only, it could be just cooling, but you're aggregating that together through a network of pipes. And then because you have that load aggregated together, I can apply a variety of fuels or technologies to meet the heating and cooling needs of those buildings. You could look at it as basically I have all of this energy, much like an electrical grid. I have the needs of these buildings or these customers, and I'm going to send energy out to them. But actually, as we get into fourth generation, we're actually sharing energy even between buildings. So because of you aggregate this load together, you interconnect them thermally, then you have a lot of flexibility in what you can do to serve those buildings. You can have technology scaled up to serve the energy needs of those buildings, where you wouldn't otherwise be able to do it on a building by building basis. So things like storage, cascading thermal energy. So thermal energy used in one process is then repurposed and used in another process because you have them interconnected thermally together. And that gives you a platform. By having buildings connected together thermally, then I can work to decarbonize that thermal grid. District energy systems have been around a long time. This is actually a picture of a system in St. Paul, which is our parent company, District Energy St. Paul. And this system has been around. Originally, the plant has been around for over 100 years. It served the streetcars, so it generated electricity that served the streetcars in St. Paul, but it also generated steam that served some customers in the downtown area. So these kinds of systems have been quite prominent in a variety of places around the US and around the globe. And some of those have been around for decades and decades, generations. In the Minneapolis, St. Paul, yes.
There's a question in the chat. Sorry for the.
Okay. Sure.
Mention of heat pumps. This is happening a lot in the presentation, and there's just a question around temperature points where heat pumps aren't very effective.
Yes. So heat pumps do have their limitations on what kind of temperatures they can produce. And then we can get into that a little bit later on in the fourth generation. I've got a slide coming up on that, is that for lower temperatures, particularly for buildings, if you can get the temperature of the systems below 180, even down to 140 or so, you can utilize heat pumps quite effectively. In higher temperature systems, let's say 200 degrees and more, that's challenging. There are some technologies out there, but they tend to have refrigerants like ammonia. And I've seen that in Norway, for example, where they're using ammonia-based heat pumps to integrate into higher temperature systems. So heat pumps play a role. There's a lot of work going on to advance the technology in heat pumps so they can produce higher temperatures. That's a very good question. District energy systems are quite prevalent. This is just if you wanted to take in the Twin Cities Metro, the 494, 694 loop, which I think would be pretty familiar to most people. There's actually 23 or 21 district energy systems that we know of. There's been some others that have been proposed. This 22 is one that we're working on, and I'm going to highlight a little bit for you today. And it's a mixture of systems. You have certainly systems that are serving downtown areas. A lot of college campuses have district energy systems. 3M campus has a district energy system. So they are quite prevalent in Minnesota in particular, but a lot of the Midwest states have several district energy systems. So let's get to on the heat pump side. So all district energy systems are not created equal. There's really been identified 4 generations of district energy systems. The first generation, you can see the dates at the bottom of the slide there, typically in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that you had steam systems put in, typically once through steam systems, very inefficient. Generally, they were coal-based systems, in some cases oil. And so you would have those buildings interconnected together, serving, a downtown area, for example. And so there are still several once generation systems in the US in particular. Manhattan has a once through steam system. It's a very, very large steam system. And I was on a call with them last week as they're thinking about how do we decarbonize this system. The second generation that you see there then is closed loop. You would have, could be steam, could be hot water, generally steam systems where I'm putting out steam, I'm getting back condensate, but I'm operating at higher temperatures. And again, generally going to be from coal or oil, could have natural gas in those systems. And when they were developed, they were generally coal and oil. And you have better efficiency than you have in first generation, but certainly a lot of losses in those systems. Third generation systems, more in the 80s and early 2000s, your hot water at this case, and you can integrate in more technologies. You see the theme here is that as you are reducing the temperature of the system, you're able to integrate in additional technologies. So the fourth generation is really a lot of what we're doing right now today. It is lower temperature systems, and you're looking at a variety of energy sources. It could be recovery of energy, say from a data center that's being cooled and it has waste heat. Google has done work in this area. Amazon has done work in this area where they're utilizing waste heat to then heat their buildings. So waste heat from data centers. Large scale thermal storage, geothermal, you see the list there. So as you're moving from left to right, what you're seeing is that operating temperature is going down, and so is the amount of fuel or energy that is needed to heat or cool the buildings. Likewise, greenhouse gas emissions decrease. Also moving left to right, system efficiency increases greatly as you move from left to right. And because you're operating at lower temperatures, you have more technologies and renewables that you can integrate into the system. A lot of the work that we're doing right now and that's going on in the US is more in this fourth generation, or systems that may be a third generation or even first and second generation that are now transitioning to third generation, with parts of their system being fourth generation. So I'm going to talk about some example projects and ways that you can modernize first and second generation, some of the projects that we've been engaged in doing that work. The first is in Duluth. We've been engaged with Duluth a little over 9 years now. It's an 89-year-old system. It was built in the 30s and heats the central business district. It has about 160 buildings, roughly serves about 6.5 million square feet. You can see there about how much energy it uses. It is a first generation that it, circa 2012, and that it was once through. You took water from the city, which is coming out of Lake Superior, so very cold water, about 90 million gallons per year. You would heat it up to high pressure temperature steam, send it out into the network, the buildings use it, and once they heat their buildings with it, they're dumping the water down the drain that's going back to the water treatment system, out to Lake Superior, and you start the cycle all over again. So this is the system that had been in place for 80 years when we got involved with it. Coal was essentially the primary fuel. It had natural gas backup. It hardly ran natural gas and was running on coal almost predominantly. Then it consumed about 90 million gallons of water per year. So we worked together with the city, we worked together with customers, and we came up with a vision for the system that would take advantage of another problem that the city had, and that was aging infrastructure in the main thoroughfare through downtown Duluth, where they had water and sewer lines that were in excess of 100 years. And so that all needed to be replaced. And this is very emblematic in a lot of cities in Minnesota and across the US, where you have aging infrastructure in the streets of our city. They're going to be, in some cases, relined or replaced. And so those are opportunities. So we worked together with the city. There was funding that came from the legislature to actually modernize the steam system that runs through the heart of the city and replace steam, which you can see in the steam in concrete. It's in concrete pipe through the heart of the city, and replace that and go to a hot water district energy system. And so we did a project that started in 2018. Construction began. You can see it there. where multiple blocks of replacing steam piping with hot water piping, closed loop. We did have some steam, particularly as the healthcare district, which is towards the 2019 section. You see 44th Avenue East. That's the hospital end towards Essentia and St. Luke's. And once this project was moving forward and then investment was being made in Duluth and the hospitals, the hot water network is also being expanded this summer down to the hospitals, and they're also going to be connected up to the hot water network. And the steam that is used is going to be closed so that the condensate is recovered. So this has produced a lot of significant improvements already in just, as you can see, 2020 was that the section was closed here in Superior Street. And so we've made a lot of progress. You can see from 2014. Today, in the past 10 years, coal has been reduced by, it is now using 1/30 of what it was using when we got involved in the system 9 years ago. 92% reduction since 2010. The CO2 emissions have been reduced significantly. So on a megawatt hour sales basis, they've essentially been halved. And you've got ash and a number of other things. The buildings that transition from steam to hot water, some buildings have achieved as much as 40% energy savings. But you are seeing 25 to 40% energy savings at the buildings that were once steam and now are hot water. And the amount of loss that we had in this system, particularly when we closed this 2020 section, the amount of losses in the distribution system were reduced to the point that it actually is as much energy as the largest heating customer on the system. So significant energy savings have been achieved by transitioning this part of the system. By the time we get into 2022, more than half of the load will all be hot water, and the energy savings and the water savings are quite significant. Next one I want to share with you is a second generation system. This is for Oberlin College. Some of you might be familiar with this college. It is located in Oberlin, about 30 miles or so outside of Cleveland. Well-known liberal arts college, particularly for its sustainability stance. And so this was their call for action. We started working with them in 2015. They wanted to be carbon neutral by 2025, and they had an antiquated steam system. In this case, it was second generation. They had a closed system, but it was quite inefficient. And they had many other needs on the system as well, related to electrical infrastructure and fiber and so forth. So they wanted to come up with a plan on how do they decarbonize, and as a result of going with district energy approach, they were able to do many other things. So they had goals. This is their goals and priorities, things that they shared with their community about operational savings, carbon reduction, but also community benefit. So while this system is being developed for the campus, this campus is really in the heart of the city. In many ways, the Oberlin College is the city. And so because it is in such close proximity to the downtown area, once it is put in place for the campus, it will be expanded to serve other private buildings as well. In fact, there's a couple of churches that are already going to be connecting up to the system during this initial phases. So this project is started construction. We laid out a plan with them and then worked to get that plan designed. And now we are in implementation. It will take 4 years to modernize this system. There's approximately 55 buildings that will be, the efficiency will be improved, control systems improved. This will be a geothermal well field system. So we're going to be jumping from a second generation system to a fourth generation system. The heating and cooling for the campus will be electrified using heat pumps, with the geothermal well field for both a source of both heating and cooling energy. And also because they're doing this, they're going to be modernizing electrical infrastructure, the campus fiber network. There's just a number of things that they're going to be doing with this particular project. So the first phase of buildings will begin served with hot water yet this fall for this heating season.
Ken,
Carbon
one
emissions?
one other quick question for you.
Okay.
Sorry, Ken. And
No
I think
worries.
it relates to the previous question that we had around how in a district energy system can you integrate heat pumps when temperatures go below 0 degrees or things like that? And
So in this case, the heat pumps are utilizing the geothermal well. And so the temperature is very constant in the geothermal well. So you're lifting the source energy from 55 degrees, or actually as you start to utilize the geothermal wells, you're putting energy in that you're storing. When you're in cooling mode, you're storing heat and you're going to recover that heat later on. So you're not operating it from outdoor air temperature, you're operating it from the energy that you've already stored down in the earth.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Ken.
Mm-hmm. So this one, the carbon emission reduction is quite significant. When it is completed, they will have, by 2025, they will be within 11%. I think now they're estimating they're going to be within about 8% of being carbon neutral on the campus. And so they're talking about now how they will get that last bit out, whether they're doing carbon offsets or other improvements on the campus. But this was the largest source of carbon emissions for the campus, was the heating and cooling of their buildings. And that is going to be taken care of with this particular project. Very, very cool project, very challenging project. As you can imagine, you have a campus that basically buildings are unoccupied during the summer. And so you've got to do a lot of work in those buildings in a short period of time. So they're ready to receive students this fall. Some of the other benefits that have happened here: reduce some water use, improve campus energy efficiency by 30%. On the buildings end, that's a low side. It'll actually probably be more than that in many of the buildings, based upon our experience in other projects that we have done on improving the efficiency of buildings. It's within the carbon goals, and then they want to provide carbon neutral energy to local businesses as well. So next, I want to move to some other communities. And again, if you've got questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. We will have time at the end for questions as well. So new communities that have net zero aspirations, I'm going to share a couple of those with you. Some of them are here in Minnesota. The first I'm going to share with you, though, is actually in California. So this is called Mission Rock. It is a project we've been engaged in now for, I want to say, about 7 years. The San Francisco Giants decided that they were going to take this piece of property. To give you an idea where this is located, here you see this is very close to the San Francisco Giants ballpark. The San Francisco Giants, when they built their ballpark, they self-financed it. They didn't have any public dollars in it. And then all of this development occurred around their campus, around their investment. And so the last remaining open piece of property was this parking lot owned by the Port Authority. And so they wanted to make this a very sustainable signature development in San Francisco. And they entered into an arrangement to lease this space and agreed to a number of very, very impressive goals for the campus related to sustainability, and laid out a vision for it. This is now in construction. We are the developer, and we will be the operator of the system for them. So you can see there's some steel and things going on. They have a number of things they're doing on the resilience side. Because of seawater level rising, they're actually going to raise the site so it meets projections for 2100 sea level, where it's projected to be. They've got goals around waste. On the water side and energy, these are the two areas that we're particularly engaged in. On the energy, 100% of the building energy demand will be met with renewable energy sources. And on the water, 100% of non-potable water will be met with non-potable sources. So we have a black water system, a recycling system that's being implemented to recycle water and then use it for toilets and so forth. The initial phase, it will be a traditional system. This is another 4th generation system, so low temperature, thermal energy between the buildings, and then it'll have boilers and cooling towers that are providing the heating and cooling initially, and then it will transition to utilizing the bay water to serve the heating and cooling needs of this site. So this will be a 4th generation, again, with heat pumps integrated into the heating and cooling of the buildings. On the Blackwater system, we'll save a significant amount of water per day, about 64,000 gallons of water recycled per day. Very cool project. This is expected to be operational in 2023. Another project we're engaged in is Towerside Innovation District. This is also 4th generation. This is should be familiar to folks by the U of M campus. You see well, it was TCF Bank Stadium. Now I guess it's Huntington Bank. And the Towerside District is in this area along light rail. You see the silos. And so this was actually a community that came together. They wanted to do something special in this area. They have an area that they're doing stormwater sharing for the development that's occurring. They wanted to do some other things in sustainability, particularly around energy. And we worked together with them to come up with a vision for the energy system. And the developers then would have buildings that are hydronic, able to do low temperature, integrated into heat pump, and then could use a variety of energy sources to meet the energy needs of those buildings. This was one that got some press as we were trying to tie initially into the wastewater. There's a main sewer line that runs down University Avenue here that actually is a sewer line that goes from Minneapolis all the way over to St. Paul into a water treatment facility, or wastewater treatment facility. And we wanted to tap into that and utilize some energy from it. Weren't able to get that done, but we then pivoted to utilizing another technology that's quite prevalent in Europe, but not so much here in the US and Canada. And that is an aquifer thermal energy storage. It's kind of it is a form of geo-exchange, somewhat similar to what we might call a geothermal system, except that it's open loop. And so this case, what you're doing is when you are in summer mode and you are cooling the buildings, you're pulling the water from the aquifer, you're running it through a heat pump, producing the chilled water that is needed for the building. So there's another loop that's tied to the aquifer does not enter, the water from the aquifer is not, and the loop for the cooling and the heating is actually separate. And so you're utilizing the cold water for cooling, and you are taking the waste heat, because when you're, much like a refrigerator, when you are cooling your internal part of your refrigerator, you're dumping the heat into your kitchen. Similar here, when you're in cooling mode, you have heat that's going to be rejected, and that heat then would be stored in the aquifer. In the winter time, you just go the opposite way. I take the warm water out of the aquifer, run it through the heat pump, lift it up to my operating temperature, and I am producing waste cooling. And I put that down into the aquifer, and I use that then in cooling season. So this is a technology that's been used in Europe quite prevalently, not so much here. We've been working with the Minnesota Department of Health. This site actually has drilled test wells. Part of the challenge with this technology is when you put the thermal energy down into the aquifer, will it flow away from you? Because aquifers aren't stagnant. The water does move, underground river. And so you want to see how fast it's flowing. This has already been tested and it looks very, very favorable. This project is now moving forward into financing. If all goes well, we'll begin development of this next year. The last one I want to mention is also a Minnesota-based project. This is one that's not in development yet, but it had some interesting features that I wanted to highlight for you. So this was a brownfield site in Arden Hills. It used to be an Army ammunitions manufacturing site. Some of you might be familiar with it. Ramsey County purchased the site and came up with a plan on, and they wanted to be very sustainable. And so we were engaged with a team to look at what could you do on this particular site to serve the heating and cooling needs of the built environment. Some interesting features. There was areas we looked at solar. You can see to the top of the screen, primer tracer was one particular area that had some contamination that was stabilized. So really nothing could be built above it, 40 acres. And we said, well, that would make a good site for solar. But one of the really interesting features of this is because the aquifer underneath this site was contaminated, 2 million gallons of water every day is pumped out of this aquifer and is processed, and then it is dumped into basically a gravel pit, and then it just seeps back and returns back to the aquifer. The temperature of that aquifer, the water coming up is very stable and doesn't vary very much at all over a year. And so we looked at how much energy was in that groundwater that was coming up, and we could use it. So basically you would, after you did the treatment, you'd run the energy through, you'd run the water through a heat exchanger, and you would utilize it either to take heat from it and lift it up, or to reject the heat into it as it's going back into the groundwater treatment. And it would provide heating and cooling to residential buildings and many other buildings. And this site then would be able to avoid putting in natural gas infrastructure altogether. And because you're constantly, one of the things we looked at is because you're constantly moving that water, you could actually look at some micro hydro to generate electricity as well on that site. This site, the development has not moved forward as of yet. It will at some point. And I think even now, because of the delay with the development, there will be a lot of interest in moving forward with a very sustainable energy system serving this site. So I'll give you some examples. One thing we are seeing a great deal of interest and movement on, and this is occurring certainly in Europe and Asia, but here in the US and Canada, is geo-exchange based systems. We're using either an aquifer, it could be a body of water, it could be wasted energy in a sewer as a geo-exchange type system, and then you electrify that so that you are producing carbon-free heating and cooling. We're seeing this in a number of locations. So district energy, it enables net zero communities and districts. You can advance a first generation or second generation system. Be very difficult to leave a first generation system and just try to electrify it or decarbonize it. You must work on the efficiency of it, which means either closing that loop or transitioning it to at least hot water, which is what we've done in Duluth. And then you combine that with advancing the building efficiency. So once you have aggregated that load together, you advance the building efficiency. Because you've now got that load aggregated together in a district, you can provide, you can actually integrate several other technologies to move it forward. So you can recover energy in some areas and cascade and reuse that energy in other areas and ensure that there. So before I get to opening up for questions, one thing I want to make sure, and those that know me know that I would hit on this in some shape or form, and that's efficiency. Efficiency is absolute must to accelerate decarbonization. We have done great work and are doing great work and are projected to do great work to decarbonize the electrical grid. And now it's how we use that energy. A big part of this is we're going to have to use that energy efficiently, because there's only so much of it we're being generated. And to the extent that we can leverage that energy and so that it goes farther, decarbonize as quickly as we possibly can. And efficiency is going to be a very big part of that. A quote that I like from Hubert Humphrey, great senator from Minnesota, and he said, "Unfortunately, our affluent society has also been an effluent society." Now, we produce a lot of waste, and that is correct. We are producing a lot of waste. And so in Minnesota, this is the most recent data that's available. We use about 1.85 trillion BTUs in our economy in Minnesota on an annual basis. This is for everything. and we waste over 57% of that energy. Most of that waste is in the form of waste heat. From power generation, but also from the built environment, and certainly you have transportation as well. Buildings are a largest consumer of energy in the state. If you take residential, commercial buildings, the energy that goes into it, either from power generation or natural gas or whatever fuel you're using, that is the largest consumer of energy in our state. And most of that's, a lot of that's heating, certainly cooling as well. If we are going to get after decarbonization, we have to improve the efficiency, and not just 1%, 2%, 3%. We're going to have significant efficiency gains in the built environment. And part of it is how we use energy. District energy systems enable us to integrate buildings together thermally, and then also reuse energy between buildings thermally. So as I mentioned earlier, giving this example here of an aquifer thermal energy storage, actually when we are in heating or cooling mode, you're taking the wasted energy that would otherwise be used by a building. So if I was just doing on a building basis, and I'm running my air conditioner like we have been doing a lot this summer, I'm rejecting that heat outside. But these kinds of systems, I'm actually able to store that heat and either use it for my building or someone else's building. So you're now aggregating the load together, but you're also be able to reuse that thermal energy at a later time, and that's carbon-free energy. And that's one of the things that you're able to do with a district energy system. It's an efficiency play, it's a storage play, it's also a decarbonization play. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that folks have. I'm going to leave my screen sharing up because someone might want me to go back to a particular slide, but I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Awesome. Thanks, Ken. Folks, maybe you can use the raise hand feature too if you want, and we can go off mute just to make it a little more interactive if that works. We do have one question already in the chat. From Ivan, is 120-degree hot water adequate to heat a small home with a forced air system using an A coil?
Is it possible? Yes. What's important, and this is when you get into the heat transfer, is how much coil surface area do you have, so that as you're moving air across it, you're able to transfer as much energy as you need then to lift up the temperature in that home. I have my cabin, I will call it, that is a geothermal system. And I can tell you, it does work quite well. It just heats up a little slower than if I was operating at 180 degrees. So that system operates more like at 130, 140 degrees. So yes, you can heat a home with that kind of temperature. The coil surface area is going to matter a lot. If you're just going to use an A coil similar to what you would normally use, it's going to do it, but it's going to take some time because you have to move that air across that coil and have that heat transfer.
Great, thanks, Ken. Another question, how do we avoid public bodies taking the line of least resistance and choosing a gas boiler or approach?
Well, this to me, one of the things that we work with communities, if they're thinking about what are your goals? So when we work with a group of people and you have these kind of decisions being made, I think it's important for everybody to get around the table and agree on what are the principles that we're going to operate on as we're making these kinds of decisions. And if you can agree that we want to decarbonize by a certain date, or we want to achieve certain things, then you can start screening out the alternatives that don't align with that kind of approach. Otherwise, it's really difficult if you're just going to do it on a building by building basis to deal with these things. You don't have overarching goals. It's very difficult to say, well, this is what we're trying to achieve, and this is why. You have to get to the why. You're not going to go down the road of just utilizing natural gas infrastructure. So I think the big picture and the principles you're trying to achieve are very important. Any project that we get engaged in, and oftentimes we have to take a step back and say, okay, are we really all agreed on what the principles are that we're trying to achieve, as then we start making decisions down the road as to how we're going to achieve them.
Great, thanks, Ken. Beth, Go ahead.
Hi, Ken. Thank you so much. Beth Calliston. I work for the city of Northfield in Minnesota here. I think my question is, so we have Xcel Energy as our gas and electric for our whole city. How does something like district energy, and we do have two district energy systems, at least what Carleton and St. Olaf College, but how would that work if we wanted to create more where we have that franchise agreement with Xcel?
Well, that'd be a conversation with them. Certainly, the franchise agreements, from I'm familiar with, does not preclude a community from doing some other kind of an energy system in that community. It provides that business the opportunity to sell whatever commodity or service that they're providing. But unless it's exclusive or unless it somehow prohibits something else being developed, you could do that with the community. I think this is probably about as good a time as any to engage with any utility. And I will say that Xcel has been moving very rapidly as a utility to think about, particularly on the electrical side, the decarbonization of their system, and then how they leverage that decarbonized energy, electricity, in order to decarbonize communities. So I think you would have a utility, particularly in Xcel, that would engage with you in a conversation. And again, it gets back to, what are you trying to achieve as a community? And then you can start working on how you're going to get there, working with the utility provider. It's not easy. It's hard work. But if you have come around a set of goals, principles you're trying to achieve, that makes the conversations actually easier.
Great, thanks, Ken.
Kevin knows, just one highlight, as Kevin knows, and we've spent time in Germany, and I've spent a lot of time in Germany, but elsewhere as well, you see that as a common theme. Where you have developed a set of principles of what you're trying to achieve, then you can work towards those solutions to achieve them. There's going to be compromises, because some of the things you might want to achieve, or maybe in the timeline that you want to achieve them, are not possible or economically feasible, whatever that might be. They might be stretch goals, but at least by having them, you can have tough conversations, get creative, and try to figure out, how do we get there? And if we can't get there in this time frame or achieve these outcomes, what can we achieve, and how can we set ourselves up to eventually achieve the outcomes that we're looking for?
Awesome. Thanks, Ken. Sorry for jumping in a little too early there. Yeah. Another question from the chat. Have any townhomes been developed that use a central energy system?
Yes, there have. There's been some projects that we've been engaged in that are using central systems. It could be just as simple as a hydronic system with fan coils. It's basically hydronic and using fan coils to heat and cool the spaces. So we've been engaged in projects like that. In some cases, you have buildings that are using heat pumps. I would say that's where it's more moving. Is to the lower temperature, utilizing heat pumps. And one of the things that heat pumps give you is you get a multiplication effect, that if I put in 1 unit of energy, I might get 3, 4, 5, depending upon the heat pump and the operating conditions. I might get quite a multiplier. So it's a very efficient way to heat and cool buildings. There's a lot of factors to consider, and it's a way then to also integrate electrification. If you're utilizing renewable energy or clean energy, carbon-free energy as your source energy, then you can get to a carbon-free outcome for heating and cooling. So yes, it's being done.
Awesome. I have one other question, and then there might be a few others that come in. Well, one for you, kind of on a personal level, Ken. Utility systems and kind of operators is kind of a legacy profession. So I guess I'm curious if you don't mind sharing what some of your sources of inspiration and kind of what's inspired you to kind of move or recognize kind of what this next wave of energy opportunities and willingness to kind of participate.
I would say that certainly have gotten inspiration from in our industry from other systems in the US, but I would say most of my inspiration has come from Europe and increasingly Canada. So where you have had a movement to decarbonize. And I think that's the biggest shift that's happened. We've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we move to renewables, but the conversation has fundamentally changed to how do we decarbonize. And when you move the conversation from renewable energy to decarbonization, then you start thinking much more creatively about how we're using the energy. What are we using to generate? Can we reuse energy? And a lot of that inspiration is more a holistic approach, symbiotic approach, systems thinking approach. You're seeing that in areas that have been working more aggressively on reducing carbon than they have been focusing on renewable energy. And it's kind of a transition that you see. You've seen that in Europe in particular, where they started thinking about, well, how do we get more renewables on the grid? And then they pivoted to, well, how do we use this renewable energy to decarbonize? Because that's really the outcome we're trying to get to. Renewable energy is the means to an end. It's not the end. The end is decarbonization.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Another question that came in: when water is integrated in the aquifer, does this pollute the water that may come back as drinking water downstream?
It does not. So these systems are closed in that the water is drawn from the aquifer, it's run through a heat exchanger, and it's put back into the aquifer. So the water is never integrated in with any of the heating and cooling other than to take thermal energy from it, or so you're either moving heating into it or cooling out of it, and that's the only way that you're touching the aquifer. That would be with the aquifer thermal energy storage. So there's not contamination. You do have in some places legacy systems that are once through systems that they would basically take the water, utilize it. We had that actually in St. Paul and other places for a while. That didn't so much contaminate the aquifer, but you were depleting it, if you will, using it for cooling and then dumping it down into the sewer. But I have seen some other, and one doesn't come to mind the exact example, but where they have utilized aquifer and it's more of an open system. That's not what we're talking about here. So we've had a lot of conversations, particularly about ADIS with the Minnesota Department of Health. They had to permit any of the well drilling that was done and have indicated that based upon the approach of how we're going at this, it's not permitted yet, but they would be open to it and favorable to these kinds of systems, given the approach to making sure we're not contaminating the aquifer. Very, very important.
Great, thanks, Ken. Beth, do you have another question?
Yeah, one more, and this is very, very site specific, but I'm trying to understand the technology, I guess, here. So we may be building, still very much a may, a drinking water treatment facility in our community. Could the geothermal type of approach be used to power the facility? It doesn't so much need heat, but it needs power for the treatment process.
Not really. Yeah, that would be, you certainly could use it to heating and cooling. One thing you could think about as you are bringing up that water from the aquifer, how to utilize it in your treatment process, not only to treat the water, but could you take some thermal characteristics from it for the heating and cooling of that building, or maybe something nearby? Because the temperature of the water that you're going to be bringing up is a very constant temperature. And could you utilize it either as a heat source or heat sink for something nearby? I don't think you're going to be able to do much for your individual building. I'll give you an example. In Toronto, they have one of the largest deep water cooling systems in the world. And where that idea came from was they were pulling water out of the Great Lakes, and they were having to heat up that water before they then treated it and put it into the drinking water, potable water for the city. Very cold water. And so the idea was, well, before we take that and utilize that energy, let's actually run it through a heat exchanger. We're going to warm it up a little bit and use the cold that's coming from that water, the thermal energy from that water, and utilize it to cool buildings. So many of the buildings in downtown Toronto, in the central business district, are cooled naturally from the cold water, the drinking water, as it's being pumped out of, I guess it's Ontario, being pumped out of that lake, and it is then used for cooling. And so maybe that's an idea here for you, is thinking about how could you use that thermal energy that is going to be in that water that you're going to be coming up, and then and utilizing for your potable water in your community. But as far as powering it, I don't think there's really an opportunity there. I would look more to solar or potentially wind.
Great, Ken. I gave folks a final opportunity and then a few more came in here. So are you aware or have anything to share about the Darcy geothermal systems? Are you familiar with that approach?
I'm not.
Okay.
Familiar with that one.
Another question is, what sorts of steps do these systems take to be able to integrate the technologies and energy sources of the future?
So I'm not exactly sure on the question, what kind of steps you take. It gets to what are we really trying to achieve? And part of this is to look at what operating temperatures do we want the system to operate, and that then gets to the buildings that are going to be receiving that thermal energy. And so as Kevin mentioned at the front end, district energy is being worked on in Rochester. And so one of the discussion points is, what is the temperature of the systems needed for the buildings? And because the building heating and cooling systems need to have the coils, as we talked earlier, to be able to transfer the energy, either heating or cooling, into the space. So you have to look at it as a system perspective. What am I trying to accomplish with the thermal energy at the customer end of this? And then you have to look at then what parameters is that set as far as the operating conditions of the system. Once you know that, you can think about what are the energy sources that I want to blend in. You could work it the other way as well. Say, well, I have this wasted energy stream, and because I have that with these kinds of conditions, what technologies could I use to move that temperature up or down, whatever I need to use it for the customer side of things, and see if you can find a match. It's a bit of an iterative process depending upon if you're starting it from the source or you're starting it from what you're trying to achieve. But that's the process you go through. We have an entire process that we look at then. What are all the alternatives? And oftentimes when you're working on these kinds of systems, you're looking at the building itself or the campus itself. What we do is a process called, we look beyond the edge. What is around us that might be able to be used? Who could we partner with that might have some waste heat or some waste cooling or some other variable that could be of benefit to the entire system and to them. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome, Ken, thanks. One last question. How is hot water metered?
Yes, so hot water for heating, you're basically measuring flow and temperature. So you're measuring what's your flow into it, and then the temperature change of that energy, and you can calculate then how much energy you're using out of that water. Very, very common approach, something we've done in many locations. We have in St. Paul, we have smart meters that are doing 1 minute data, and it tells you a lot about how a system is operating when you have that kind of granularity.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Ken. We did reach 1 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time, including Ken's. But thank you very much, Ken, for being here.
Thank you all.
This was awesome, and we'll see you next month. So,
bye-bye. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks. Bye.